Welcome, everyone. I'll share my screen. You probably don't need to. Oh, looks like it's shared already. Cool. You don't really need to code along with me. It might be better if you just did this at the end yourself. And this should all be things that you can do yourself in your own environment. I just realized I don't have links in here on how to set up a free Azure account. However, but you should be able to just do a quick Bing search or Google search and set up an Azure environment if you want. So again, my name is Dave Wenzel, and I work at what they call the Microsoft Technology Center in Philadelphia. And I pretty much spend all day talking to customers about the kind of stuff that we'll talk about today. So the Chat GPT and OpenAI stuff is probably top of mind for all of you. And I'm going to go in to a little bit of detail on a use case that you can actually code up yourself on your own. And it should actually be a pretty advanced use case that if you can kind of follow along with that, you pretty much know what the rest of us know at this point as far as how all of this stuff works. So I'll walk you through it and I'll show you essentially how you can do this stuff on your own. It's not actually that hard. That's one of the things that I like to impress upon people is all of this is actually relatively easy to do. So we'll go through as much as we can. And then if you have questions or anything on basics, put them in the chat and we'll spend a lot of time doing Q&A because generally what happens is a lot of people just have very generic questions involving how OpenAI works and ChatGPT and those types of things. And it's kind of really foundational knowledge. So I'll go through all of that stuff and it may be helpful for you as well. So I do have a GitHub repo. Hopefully somebody put that in the chat. If you can see it on my screen, it's right there. My repo is just basically a little bit on how you can get started. And then I have pointers to two other repos. So I'll go over that. And just real quick, if you do have any questions and you want to reach out to me afterwards, I do have my LinkedIn information there. Just, make a connection request and, ask away and we can help you with this stuff. So I'm more than happy to do that just to let you know. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at a use case that we've talked about within Microsoft, and we've actually demoed this, and we have it available so that you can kind of deploy it yourself. And I always tell people this particular demo actually goes over a lot of different topics as far as ChatGPT and OpenAI works. And if you can just follow along with the repo, if you come up with where you work for your company, if you come up with a really good use case for this stuff, instead of just starting from scratch and coding it all from scratch, it's much easier to just start with these two repos potentially, and use that as a starting point, and then just modify them for your particular use case. And it tends to work really well. And that's actually how I solve problems for customers. So the way we do this, and I have all of this laid out in here. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but we do have a video. I have a link to a YouTube video on how all of this works that we did at one of our events. And it's a use case involving basically a website. So I'll show it for you here. I just have this running locally, so you don't even need to run this in Azure. And I have the repo out there. You can build it yourself. And basically what it is, it's all AI generated images. But the point is this would be almost like a retail consumer experience. And what we want to do is basically be able to say, if they hit this chat button down here, we can have them do like a chat style interface involving this fictional uh, retailer. Okay, so you could, for instance, go out there and say, what are the last 10 things I purchased from your company, or can you give me a recommendation for a pair of shoes based on previous purchases I've made. You can even upload images of shoes that you're looking for, or you can ask all kinds of questions, and it will give you chat-based responses. And all of it is done under the covers, including the image generation stuff using OpenAI. So that's what kind of everybody is talking about. So that's how we do it. So in the repo, I have where you can find this web interface. I'm not really going to use that after now. Just want to point out this is what we're actually going to do. Instead, I'm going to focus on what a data scientist would work on, which is essentially I want to get the chat-based interface to work outside of the website, and I want to be able to do testing and things like that. So that's what we're kind of going to go through. So in my repo here, I have exactly what you have to do to get this up and running. So if you have an Azure account already, we do within Microsoft, uh, we want everybody to go through what they call the Azure OpenAI approval process. It's just a little form, takes about an hour. And all we're doing is just seeing essentially what use cases folks in the customer community are potentially using Azure AI for. We're not gating anything. So it's not like, you have to use it for the intended purpose that you put in the form. It's just something we're trying to monitor. And then I do have two repos. One is the actual stuff the data scientists would be interested in. So that's this one. Okay. And then essentially there's one that is basically that little website that I did, which is this one. Okay. This one's real easy to set up, so it's not even worth really going through. This one, however, when I went out and I just double checked everything was working yesterday for this event today, I realized that some people checked in some code and everything was broken. So when you clone that repo down, just use this particular command. And what that's going to do is it's going to go back a couple of check-ins to code that I definitely know is working because I tested it out yesterday. Okay. So what we want to do is just talk through what this solution is actually looking for. So again, in this chat-based interface, I want to be able to go out there and just ask miscellaneous questions that might be interesting to a retailer. Okay, this is certainly not the only use case for OpenAI and ChatGPT style chatbot interfaces, but it's kind of one that is very common, and it's something that's very easy to think about conceptually. Okay. So I want to be able to go out and say things like, I want to do a search, for instance, using this and say, I'm looking for a tent that, has such and such properties. And I wanted to go out and look at my product catalog. And the product catalog, might be in PDFs. But in this case, I just have it in Excel file as a like more or less a CSV file. But you could do PDFs. It just adds just the ever so slightly bit of complexity to it. But that's it. And then I also have some data out here that's going to have customer data, and we keep that in a database. For the customer database, we use Cosmos DB, and it's just we have like 10 rows in there. These aren't huge databases. And Cosmos DB, in case you're unaware, is basically a NoSQL style database, so not unlike, say, MongoDB. And we keep that out there just to keep things simple. It's very easy to connect up to that database. And then essentially what we want to do is we're going to add things like indexes to this data and so forth. So that's what the code is going to do. And then what I'll walk you through also is how we actually build the prompting so that a user can figure out how to do or how we can build like prompt safety and things of that nature within the website. So that, for instance, if somebody goes in here and puts, in their chat, they want to, a recommendation for a tent, we make sure that we give them recommendations for tents that we actually carry, and we're not, sending them over to a competitor's website. And if you follow Chat GPT and OpenAI on the internet at all, you know that that's been a problem because companies are deploying OpenAI and ChatGPT, and they're not properly grounding the data. And when they're not properly grounding the data, potentially it's going out there and it's going to make recommendations for their competitors' websites. If you've never seen that, I can give a demo of that. And again, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll go through that. I hope I'm not either talking over or under anyone's heads at this point. So we'll show you how to do that so that we're sure that it is actually providing answers that kind of make sense, if that makes sense. Okay. One thing you have to understand is when we actually putting data out there that we want to search using OpenAI. So in other words, unstructured data. So PDFs or things of that nature, we have to index that data first. And when we index that data, we do what's called a vector search, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, don't worry about it. It's a very technical thing. And just know that within the Azure ecosystem, you don't really even have to understand all that much about vectorization and what, vector indexes are. It's just a checkbox that says, I want to vectorize my data in the index. And it just kind of goes out and does it. And it's a totally lights out situation. And pretty much you always want to do that. So it's not like something that you have to make some hard decisions on. So I have that out there. And then finally, the last thing we're going to look at is prompt flow, which is basically how I can go out and create kind of an end-to-end orchestration on all of these things so that when people actually use the chat interface within our website, that it understands what's called the memory of the chat. So if I go out there and I start asking questions and I come back later and continue the conversation, it understands that context. And then I want to be able to do things like, testing. Is it giving the right answers, or is it giving answers that I think are the right answers, and so forth and so on. So that's what we're going to do. I do have some other, resources down here. If you're looking for other examples of how to use Azure OpenAI, and these, chat GPT style interfaces, we have all kinds of samples out there. But this one is kind of the most advanced one we have. So it's one that it's probably worthwhile doing. And it really only takes an hour or two to set up. It's not terrible. Okay. The last thing I'll say is if you go and deploy any of this and you're stuck, again, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. But also, if you have any problems, sometimes with free environments, they won't let you necessarily spin up Azure OpenAI because it is kind of a premium service. Is just hit me up on LinkedIn and I can temporarily let you use mine. And then you can at least see how this stuff works in the real world. Again, within here, I do have links to a video you can watch, which is the demo of how we actually do the website. But today we'll focus just essentially on the code. So that's what we want to kind of talk through. So the way it works is if you clone the repo down, and you have to do this one extra step, and that's probably just for the next few days that you have to do that step. Essentially, the way I do it, and within that repo, there are all kinds of instructions on how this works. You can actually code all of this. Oops, excuse me. You can actually code all of this within a browser. So you can use code spaces, as it's called, or you can do it totally manually and install all the software in your machine. I don't really do browser-based development. I like to do everything within VS Code. So there's a third option, and that's the option I like to use, and it's using VS Code. And if you've never used VS Code, in that repo, we go over how to download VS Code and how to install it. And then essentially what we do nowadays when we do development, especially data scientists like me that tend to do a lot of things with Python. If you've ever used Python before, setting up a Python environment in Windows is challenging to say the least. So I like to tell people, the best way to use Python on Windows is not to use Python on Windows. So what we've done in this repo is we use dev containers essentially. So what you'll do, and this is all out in the instructions, I'm not going to go through it now, but you can go out there and we give you a dev container. And as long as you have the necessary extensions installed on your VS Code, it should launch the dev container. And all a dev container is essentially, it is a Docker container where we have all of the requisite software installed such that it should work on any device that you have. So if you do development on a Macintosh, it should work. Windows, it should work. Any kind of flavor of Linux, it should work. I haven't tried an Android phone or anything like that. That might be a bit of a challenge, but in theory, it should run anywhere. That's the key thing. So once you have that dev container up and running and you get this, you actually get the repo in there. We do a little provisioning script that actually deploys all of the Azure resources. So I'm going to briefly flip over here. The way the Azure resources are deployed, oops, looks like I ran out of memory, is we deploy everything to a resource group. Okay. And your resource group, if you deploy this stuff, is probably going to be a little bit different than mine, but we deploy all kinds of services here. Now, most of these services are relatively inexpensive. So if you spin this up in your Azure environment and you shut it down, like say in a week, it should only run about 10 or $13 in expense. Again, if you have a free account, you'll be fine. Um, you probably do want to shut this off at some point or just delete the resource group if you're not using it. And again, it's easy enough to redeploy it at a later date. So I just lay that out there. And we have all kinds of services that we deploy to make all of these things work that I'm going to show you today and that you can play along on your own. So all of these services are out there, but it's going to deploy all of these and it kind of wires everything up as well. So that's the key thing. But forgetting about all of that because that's just Azure minutia, and you can kind of figure that out on your own. We want to talk about how the prompting and everything works within Azure and how we can build these prompt-based interfaces. So what I've done here is and I do it like this. So let me shrink this window down. This is what's called prompt flow, and this is what data scientists are most interested. This creates kind of an orchestration or a workflow on how your users are going to interact with a chatbot. Now, again, I want to say this one more time. Honestly, chatbots are kind of the least interesting way to use ChatGPT and OpenAI. But it's an easy way to conceptualize how you use this stuff because everybody's seen chats. So it's not that difficult. Okay. So what this is here is this prompt flow. Oops. And you don't have to use this prompt flow tool. You can all do it manually, and I'll show you how to do that within the browser. You can actually even do this in the browser as well. But again, we give you a dev container. It's probably easiest to do it here. But what this does is it shows a workflow of how users will interact with the system. And this is just one version of a prompt flow. And the point of prompt flow is I can create different variants of this. And then I kind of have an ability to do kind of QA testing, if you want to think of it this way. Okay, so all these prompt flows, they're directed acyclic graphs, as it's called. So we assume everything is done in order and there's no cyclical references. So you're not going back and doing the same thing. And if you were to go back and do the same thing, it's really not going to hurt anything because it does understand context. Okay, so it always starts with a set of inputs. Okay, and again, if you can visualize this from the web page, the inputs I have listed over here. So it's the chat history, and there is none. So I assume this is a brand new um, user that's coming out and hitting the system. And then I ask it a question. So what I can do here is put in some sample questions that I think users would ask, and it should answer those questions. So here it says, I got to make this window a little bit bigger. What can you tell me about your jacket? So that's something a user might put in there. If you're a tester, you might want to put in things that you think might be kind of bad things you don't want your chatbot to respond to. And I'm not going to list those things. I'm sure you can use your imagination and figure out what that is. Okay. And then the other input is just the name of the customer ID. And I would get that probably via a cookie or some other method. I could even ask them, what their email address is or if they're a previous customer. But here, we just keep this simple. Okay. So I get some inputs here. And then the first thing I need to do is figure out what they're attempting to ask questions about. Okay, so that's what this is saying. This is what they call a question embedding. If you understand OpenAI, what you do is, or how these things work, is they take the question, okay, that you put in, and then it creates these things called word embeddings, okay, or vectors. And the word embedding is just, it kind of takes the sentence down and the words down into kind of something that's a little bit more generic than plain English. Okay. When we take those embeddings, then, so they're basically codes. Okay. Once we have those codes, it's much easier to do natural language processing because those codes are these things called vectors and it's math, and data scientists like their math. So we can take that and we can take those embeddings and send it into what's called a search index. Okay. So again, my actual data about products is very basic. And we have that out here. I'm not going to be able to find it just very quickly, so I'm not going to bore you. But essentially, we have in here. I have all the product information instead of in a bunch of PDFs. I just put it essentially in the CSV file. So these are the product IDs. Okay, that's the name of the product and then its description. So what we're going to do is when they ask questions about the data, we're going to have it look at these descriptions versus, say, looking at a PDF. And then we're going to return the relevant data back. So that's what this is doing. So the question embedding is going to get the keywords out of here. Okay, so probably things like jackets in this case. And I'm going to send it into the search index. And the search index we use is Azure, what's called Azure AI Search. It used to be called Azure Cognitive Search. And all that is, our open source implementation of Elasticsearch. Okay. So what that means is if you currently use Elasticsearch in your corporate environment, if you took your Elasticsearch indexes, exported them, imported them into AI search, changed your connection string on your API calls, it would just magically work. There's kind of no magic that we do with it. It's just that easy to do within Azure. So I'm going to get the documents back. Essentially, that would be involved with these jackets, for instance. Okay. Here I do a customer lookup. So here I may not, the reason why this is branched off is I may not necessarily care what the customer ID is. So in this case, I just say, give me some information about your jackets. I don't care what the customer is. So the other thing this prompt will do is if it doesn't need to be context aware, okay, in other words, customer aware, it doesn't care. So it never does a customer lookup. Okay, just doesn't need to do it. Now, if I do want to find out more information about the customer because maybe they said something like, hey, what did I purchase last week? And can you make me a recommendation? Now it needs to go out and find information on the customer. So then it goes down this path. And if it can't figure out who your customer is, it'll help you with a prompt. That's what it is. Okay. So I take information from the customer lookup, okay, and the data I got out of the index, which answers the question that they have over here, and I generate the final prompt that gets sent into Azure OpenAI. Okay, so the way all of this ChatGPT and OpenAI stuff works is we're building up orchestrating these little tasks that build a larger and larger prompt. Okay, when we finally think we are ready, we take the giant prompt that we've built and we send it into the LLM and we get the response back. And when we get the response back, that's the output in this case. And there we go. That's what the user sees on their interface. So a lot of times this becomes a very complicated workflow if I need to go out and say connect to a system over here, connect to a system over there, and I need to ask the user questions in order to get to a final answer that would be compelling for them. So I'll show you how this works. If I execute this right from here and I do a run all, just hit submit anyway. I'm just going to tell it in standard mode, which means it's going to run this prompt as it stands, and it's not going to ask me any questions. And when I do that, and you got to love doing live demos because it always takes a little longer than you think it's going to take. But here it's telling you all the steps that it did up here. Okay. And then the final prompt that it actually put in, and it gives you lots of information here that you would essentially see within the UI. So here's the answer. So this would be what comes through on the UI that we build, or the website that we build. So it says, hey, Jane Doe, when it comes to jackets, we have two fantastic options. I'm not going to read this to you, but there you go. And it brings information back from these two jackets. So I can go off of the assumption, if I looked back at my product database, my products.csv, I really only have two jacket products in there. If I have more than that, then something's not right with my indexing, and I probably need to fix that. Here I got some other information on hiking boots, so forth and so on. Okay, so this is canned responses. So I can go out here. The point of this prompt flow is I can build all this up and I can test various scenarios from within the prompt flow. What happens if I ask the question this way? What happens if I ask it that way? Okay. The other thing I can do here is I can do this more or less in real time by actually interacting with the prompts just like a user would. So I'll show you that. I say run it in interactive mode. So what it does is it actually puts or it simulates what the web interface would look like, just right down here. Okay. So it says here, press enter to send your message. Okay. So what the user is that's the user message that, or the user question that I would put in the, whoops, into the prompt. And hang on a second. I think I have one pre-baked here. What is a good sleeping bag for summer use? Okay, so I put that in there, and now I can test that. So all this is doing is essentially changing that parameter. That's all it's doing. Okay, and here comes back. Hey Jane. Now again, it didn't give me all that debugging information that I saw when I ran it in kind of standard mode, because I'm not really doing debugging. So this is simulating exactly what a user would do when they're in that chat-based interface. So there you go. And if I had other prompts about, hey, show me something I bought last month, and give me a recommendation for what I should buy next, it would do that kind of stuff. But I don't want to bore you with that. This is stuff you can play with on your own. So this is how you build this stuff out. And this is probably the most interesting thing that I personally do with customers. Okay. So all of this stuff with prompt flow and doing the code, I always tell this to folks when they come in and they listen to me talk and we talk to customers. This technology aspect of OpenAI and ChatGPT is really not that interesting. Okay, it's not that hard to put this stuff together. What's interesting is the creativity that it takes to do this stuff. So what I mean is, when you talk to users and they say we have what we think is a good use case for OpenAI or just artificial intelligence in general, you coming up with your creativity that you can actually build this stuff for them. Okay. And some of that is, some of that creativity is just simple things like, what are the things they might ask us about? Right. And then can we actually make their lives a little bit easier by going out and doing things like looking up, their order history and things of that nature. So I do this all within this VS Code interface, but you can do it right from within the browser too. So I'll just show you that real quick. When you deploy the solution that comes in those GitHub repos, what you'll have out here is it deploys a whole bunch of things in Azure, which I showed you, and then you get this Azure AI Studio. And in this Azure AI Studio, I have my chat project here. Okay. And when I look at my chat project, I'm going to go over here. This is essentially the web-based version of what I showed you over within VS Code. Okay. And sometimes this will show you a lot more information without having to, go looking through YAML files. So this is a nice interface as well. So sometimes I'll use both of these interfaces together, and this just runs right in the browser, but you'll see it's exactly the same thing. And probably the thing that most people have questions about is, how do I build these prompts up? So here we show you what the base level system prompt is. So this is the system prompt. And if you've ever seen what a system prompt looks like, generally you don't show these to the user, but you're telling the AI or the OpenAI essentially what its goal in life is. So, and this is actually how you do this stuff. It's kind of weird. Sometimes when people see this, like, really, you actually type this stuff in there as part of the prompt? Yep, you do. So it says here, you are an AI agent, tells you who you work for, and you're going to answer questions, and you want to do it without getting agitated with people. That's very important. Okay. And if you remember that the answer that I got back for the first prompt was kind of, it's kind of touchy feely, as they say. So here it says add some personal flair. So you do that kind of stuff. And I can add emojis. If you saw that, I had that out here. There's usually a section involving safety when you do this, which is, I call this the no hallucination option, but it even does more than that. So what you want to do is make sure that your chatbots or your OpenAI is grounded on just the facts you want it to be available or to have knowledge about. Okay, and this is very important. If you if you follow this stuff on the internet, you'll see that there's quite a few businesses that deploy this thing. There was a car dealer, I won't mention the brand, but deployed essentially OpenAI without doing this kind of grounding, and people were going out there and asking it, and it wasn't a Tesla dealer. They were asking it for recommendations on an electric car. This was not a Tesla dealer, and it was recommending Teslas. So that's kind of a bad thing if you stop and think about it. So you tell it, only use factual data that you're aware of. So, how do you make it aware of things? Well, I tell it specifically over here to only use data that it's gotten out of the documentation, which is that CSV, or generally you would use PDFs in the real world. So that's how, or even a database, a SQL database, or something like that. Okay. And then I give it all kinds of other what they call safety. And then this is actually how you do this. And this is kind of weird to people. It's like you really just code it this way. It's kind of like meta code. And yep, it is. So I get the data out of the documentation. So it's almost like Markdown, if you want to think of it as Markdown. It's actually very close to Markdown. I get that data back and I just inject that data into the prompt. So if you remember, it recommended 2 items that were jackets and then 2 pairs of shoes. It's going to just put that stuff in line right in the prompt. Okay. So it's going to take the user prompt. It's going to add all of this information, including their previous orders, if it needs to, okay, or if you even care about it. And then it's going to give them the customer name, and it's going to say, go ahead and output the results. And what you saw in my little prompt demo is what it comes back as, and that's how you code this stuff up. It's actually something that's very easy to do. It's just getting all of this in the correct format, and get it so that it doesn't hallucinate is sometimes a little bit of a challenge, but it's not a challenge in coding. It's a challenge in creativity more than anything. So I can run this right from here. Okay, I don't want to go on too much more about this, but this is essentially what we do within these 2 repos. You can usually get this up and running in about 2 hours. It's fairly lights out because everything's done in the dev container. Probably the thing you'll struggle with most is just if you don't have an Azure subscription, how do you get started? Again, we have some helpful hints in there involving how to sign up for free Azure accounts. So before I go any further, maybe we can look, are there any questions that people have? I wasn't really paying attention to the question
We
window.
can, yeah, we can definitely have some questions here. So first is from Jack Bauer. So can you put the page number for retrieval augmented generation? So that means for the PDFs, that is, Dave.
Yes, you can. Again, this is a very simplistic example, so we don't have the PDFs. It's just coming out of a CSV file, so I just take the whole chunk and put it in. But generally, you're right. In the real world, what you would do is you would have PDFs, and then stop and think about this. I don't want to just have the customer look at a PDF that's potentially 30 pages long. I want to narrow it down to the exact page, or even maybe the exact sentence that has the information they're looking for. So the way you do that kind of stuff in the OpenAI world is when you build the index. That's the vectorization and the embeddings. Okay. So here I do embeddings on, or they're called word embeddings. Oops. Here I
Mm-hmm.
do the embeddings on the question, but on the back end, I do the same thing with the documents. So what you would do is essentially build these Azure AI search indexes that are chunked data. So again, what they should be able to do is do a search and it'll nail it down to either the exact page, the exact sentence, something like that for what they're looking for. So we can definitely do that with PDFs. There are other repos out there, and I have that link. There's other sample repos somewhere. I have it out. I have so many windows open here. There's other repos out here that demonstrate how to do that. But yes, you can definitely do PDFs. And as you mentioned, for those of you following along, what we're describing in this entire prompt flow thing is what's called retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And all that means is essentially, I don't want ChatGPT and OpenAI to answer with all the data it's learned by scouring Wikipedia and GitHub repos and Discord conversations. I want to say use that to foundationalize the language, but only answer with the data that comes out of this prompt. That's the grounding. So I say essentially ground it based on what's come out of, in this case, like the product catalog or the documentation, or it could be your PDFs, or it could be your Salesforce database, or it could be queries to some other system. So I even have example down here from a Cosmos DB or a MongoDB style database. So they call that pattern retrieval augmented generation. So great question. That's how we do that.
Okay, that's great. Another question here from Irina. How do you overcome Azure OpenAI limitations for personal accounts when working with the API?
Yeah, so you need to be able to set up Azure OpenAI in your personal account. That's actually a very good question. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll tell you what, hit me up on LinkedIn. The worst thing is I'll just give you access to for this repo, I'll give you access to my Azure OpenAI service, and you can just hit make calls against the API. That'll at least allow you to see this stuff in action. So hit me up on LinkedIn and I'll just give you my account key and API for, I'll leave it out there for a couple of days. It's not going to hurt anything. Um,
Okay,
Go
that's
ahead.
great. Another question here from Teresita. How does Azure here handling token limits from OpenAI when you
Okay.
work with
That's a very good question.
the API? Yeah.
Okay, so what you see on the screen here is essentially the prompt after I go through all of the steps in the orchestration. That prompt, which again, this actually isn't the full prompt because you don't see the information in line from the like the PDFs or in this case a CSV, but uh, basically a token in OpenAI world is about a word. Okay, if you want to think of it that way, it's actually about three quarters of a word, but be that as it may, and each of the models that you use in OpenAI has a what's called a token limit. And I don't commit this stuff to memory, but you can go off of the assumption we have some OpenAI models that have like 2,000 token limits, and there's some I think are in like 32,000. But you have to go out and read the documentation. What that means is I can't have more than 2,000 words within here within this prompt. So the way you overcome that is you have to get a little creative. So that's the creativity. And we actually have this built into Azure OpenAI. You can go out there and you say essentially you do what's called chunking. So think of it this way. I have, if you're familiar with the novel War and Peace, it's like literally like 10,000 pages. It's horrendous. It's probably not that. Um, but you can actually go out and get like Azure OpenAI to say, hey, summarize War and Peace. Here's the PDF, and summarize it as though I'm a second grader because I'm not that smart or whatever. And I've done that, and it does take some time to do, but you can do that. Now, the fact of the matter is, War and Peace, being that it is like 5,000 pages or something, obviously is more than 2,000 words. So what you do is you say, you have to get creative. Maybe I take a page at a time. Okay. And I say, summarize that page and now summarize the next one, summarize the next one. And then after I get, 100 of those pages, I say, summarize the summary and so forth and so on until I get down to brass tacks, which is I've essentially summarized War and Peace. You wouldn't actually do it that way, but that's the theory. So you chunk these things together, and you're dealing with smaller chunks. In other words, so yes, that is one of the number one things you have to get creative about whenever you deal with a large language model. Is they all have token limits. How do I get what I need within the token limit? So
Okay,
great.
that's great. Yeah, indeed, great question. Another question here from Sandeep. I hear we can set temperature to 0 so that it has more, so that the model is more grounded, given the context provided. Is that safety section in the prompt absolutely necessary? So,
Yes.
the question for you
It
here.
absolutely is necessary. So the question was, there's this thing in OpenAI called the temperature,
Hmm.
and you can set it at some level between 0 and 100. And think of it as one aspect of the slider from 0 to 100 is it's very deterministic, and the other end it's very probabilistic or it's creative. Okay, so the theory would be if you ask the same question and the temperature is low, you should get the same answer time and again, but the fact of the matter is that doesn't always happen. Okay, if you set the temperature up and you say get creative, basically you can go out and ask it the same question and it'll answer differently every time, but that has actually nothing to do with safety. Okay, when you tell it safety, safety is more things like don't make up facts. Okay. And it does have a habit of making up facts. So actually, this is a demo I've been doing for well over a year. I'll just show this to you. They call this the hallucination problem. This actually still happens today. I just do this on the OpenAI not Azure OpenAI. I do this directly in ChatGPT. If you've never seen this, this is the example I always use. It says, who is taller, Yao Ming or Shaquille O'Neal? Okay. Now, if you don't follow basketball, you may not know this, but it got the facts here accurate. Okay. Yao Ming is 7'6" and Shaq is 7'1". Okay. But then it comes up with the conclusion, and that's incorrect. So it hallucinated that. Okay. And you wanted to avoid things like that. Okay. So when you put the safety section in, you're telling it, don't make up facts. Okay. So don't make that up. But the fact of the matter is, as much as you tell it don't hallucinate and don't make up facts, it's never a guarantee. Okay. So you always have to train users when you do this stuff in the real world that they need to do a model that kind of follows the trust but verify model. Okay. So they need to trust what comes out of the LLM, but they need to verify all facts. And there's patterns you can do with that. One is to create citations. Okay. But just to follow this along real quick here, notice it got the conclusion wrong, but it did get the facts right. Now watch what you do here, and this is how these LLMs work. I say, what number is larger, 7'1" or 7'6"? It comes back, it gets the answer right. That's interesting. Now I ask the question again: who is taller, Yao Ming or Shaquille O'Neal? I just copy and paste the question, gets it right the second time. That's how this stuff works. Okay. It is kind of somewhat magical, but you also have to be aware that this kind of stuff happens, if you're not careful. So you have to do some grounding. Just to show you an example, maybe I create a chat bot like my Contoso web chat bot, and I don't want it to answer questions about Shaquille O'Neal because that has nothing to do with tents and camping supplies. Okay, I didn't. I can actually go over and do that in that chat, but here I have another one, and I say, well, notice I didn't ground this one, so it actually comes back with the exact same answer. I thought I did ground it, so there I go. It's answering questions that I really shouldn't have it answer. But if I put it back in that web interface, let me go back over to here. This is saying you should always reference factual statements. And somewhere in here, I only tell it to reference data coming from the search. So the theory would be, if I asked it who is taller, Yao Ming or Shaquille O'Neal, it should come back and say something to the effect of, I have no idea who that is. That has nothing to do with tents. And I can do that demo, but just in the interest of time, that's how it should be. So temperature is actually slightly unrelated to the safety section. But those are all very good questions, because it's helpful to understand how all this stuff interplays. So great question.
Okay, awesome. Maybe one question from my side before, because I think this is a very important aspect, is how do you measure costs associated with your OpenAI account on Azure? Because that's going to be, because you don't want to be experimenting and then costs balloon out while you're working with APIs. So maybe walk us through that, Dave, in a bit more detail.
That's very true. So within here, I don't know exactly where it's at, to be honest with you, within this
Hmm.
interface. We have another interface, but when you submit a prompt in, one of the APIs will come back and it'll tell you the number of tokens you utilized in the call. So the API will say that. And again, I'm not 100% sure where we do it from the interface, but if I looked at what you would send in through Postman, it'll say the number of tokens used. And the number of tokens used is essentially, roughly, it's the number of words in the prompt plus the number of words in the output. So you kind of merge those two together. So that's a very good question. So just to let you know, when we tried, this goes back well over a year ago, where we actually took a PDF of War and Peace and we put it in there. It took something like 8 minutes to summarize War and Peace, and it cost, I think, $2.67 in calls. So the fact that if I would have had that in high school for $2.67, I could have done a semester's worth of English literature and never read the book. That's kind of valuable. I probably shouldn't be admitting that on this forum, but anyway. So yes, that
Yeah.
you want to definitely control costs. Good point.
Okay, I have one question, additional question here from Sir Cody. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but this is a pretty big, wide question. Not sure I want to tackle this one, Dave. Is I'm new to this space. Can you walk me through what Azure is and how to use it?
Great question. Right. That's one of those you got to scratch your head and go, yeah, I don't know. I've been doing this Azure stuff for so many years. How do you describe it? Okay,
Yeah.
so Azure is just, it's a public cloud. Okay. So if you worked for corporate America, for years in corporate America, they had data centers. You can think of it as a data center in the cloud. The benefit of using Azure versus a data center is we have everything is basically as a service, it's called. So you can go out and deploy things like OpenAI, and you can deploy it for a very short term amount of period of time. So like something like we're doing today, you should be able to spin up, have it run for a week or two, and it's probably only going to cost you $10 at most. So the theory is that's much cheaper to do than, say, deploying a whole bunch of VMs, which, by the way, this OpenAI stuff requires very expensive GPUs and NPUs, and you probably don't want to make the personal investment in that kind of stuff. So the theory would be I can use this in Azure. So there are other, public clouds out there. Google has one. Amazon has one. They have slightly different services, but they all function similarly at the end of the day. So great question.
That's a elevator pitch for the entire cloud industry, I would say. Another question here from Willie. How would you do a validation process for the responses it gives? Do you use an automated validation step?
Yeah, so that would be a situation where potentially I would go out here and I would say I would make a copy of this particular orchestration, and I would say here I want to go out and say based on the question, what were the answers that came back, and then I want to make sure that. In the example I had, I believe it came back with four products, two were shoes and two were something else. If I find that to be acceptable, what I could do is, basically kind of work that into like a QA style script, or what they call LLM ops nowadays. And then if I have that, then I should be able to go out and say, I can play around with, say, and this is the thing, I might say, so this is currently deployed with what they call GPT-4, but you may say, wow, GPT-4 is very expensive. And I want to try it with GPT 3.5. And you could do that and see if it still gives you similar answers that would be acceptable, but potentially, a lot cheaper. Or you could even go out there and say, I don't want to use OpenAI. I want to use like a llama model, which should theoretically be a lot cheaper and give similar answers. And you can do all that kind of stuff. So that's the other thing with LLMs. To a degree, you can kind of swap them out and do testing. So I think that's the validation you're looking for. The other way you could do validation too is you could say, well, I have no idea the infinite number of ways that a user might ask a question, and I want to make sure, for instance, that it is giving factual answers and that I haven't created a chatbot that's a bad chatbot. Okay, I'm not going to say what bad is, but y'all know what it is. What you could do is say in the orchestration engine, I could have this entire side of the orchestration. If I make this window a little bit bigger, so this is what the user does, and then I could have another actual side that's going out there and doing a verification dynamically. So I could say take the outputs if uses GPT-4 and verify that they're factually accurate against, say, a 3.5 model or against a llama model. I forget, there's actually a term for that in the industry. I'm drawing a blank right now. And there are known patterns for that, but you're basically using one LLM to validate the output of another one, if that makes sense. So that could also be the provenance of your question. But yes, there are patterns to do that within the industry. And you can do that right from within prompt flow. Great question.
Okay, that's great. Maybe here this is not a question, but just a highlight here because we talked about cost. Sandeep mentioned they found cost analysis in the left menu of the Azure OpenAI instance. For those who want to monitor costs, maybe another question here from Teresita as well that we're getting. How can you measure the accuracy of the answers, or have some other metric to measure the accuracy of answers? So yeah, maybe what are the metrics that you should be looking at here for accuracy?
That is actually a great question, and this again comes down to you have to get creative with this stuff. So one way is to say I went out there and I searched for some topic around shoes, and I know I have two things that it should be recommending. So that is how you could consider doing accuracy just from a sheer metrics perspective. A lot of times when you deal with anything in the AI world, you need to kind of get off of this notion of just looking at things in terms of their accuracy. So, in other words, what the answer is, but maybe look at it from a different lens. So, maybe look at it from in terms of, is this valuable? Okay, so something a little softer. So, are my users actually appreciative of this? Is it getting them answers faster? Is it relieving burden on our customer service reps? Things of that nature. So, a lot of times that is a lot better metric than just simply saying accuracy. I actually have a story, but it's going to take a few minutes to go through, and I don't want to waste everybody's time. But a lot of times when you look at accuracy, you're not really thinking through a problem in the AI space differently. um, just real briefly, I don't want to go into the whole story, but there was a professor that came out in 2016, and he said that I'm sorry, AI can actually look at medical imaging X-rays and determine if there's lung cancer in an image. AI can do it generally much better than a human being. So, in other words, it has a better accuracy metric. So if you kind of stop and think about it, that his conclusion was, well, since the AI can do it better than a human, why do we have humans ever working as radiologists? And that's just such a stupid way of looking at things. Okay, if you think that the only thing a person does is a radiologist does is look at X-rays all day, and an AI can figure out if there's cancer in the X-ray better than the human, you truly don't understand what human beings do in the workforce. So maybe you need to think of it a little bit different. Just, are we actually solving problems? Are we getting, the customer to be happy with our product where maybe they weren't in the past? Things like that. Okay. Another example I'll use, I see this on the internet all the time. I won't mention companies. I saw one last week came out and they said, our AI chatbot that we deployed, it saved about 10% of a person's job. So because of that, we laid off 700 people. And I read that and I go, that's, you really don't understand math if that's the case. You don't say, because our AI chatbot saved 10% of a customer service rep's job, that I can lay off 10% of my workforce. That's not how it works. And I won't bore you with all the details, but if anybody is an HR representative on the phone, they know exactly what I'm talking about. So you got to think a little bit differently as far as accuracy. Not everything in this world has to boil down to a number. I'll just leave it at that.
That was great, and yeah, for those who are interested to see what the company is called, it rhymes with Varna. In case anyone wants to know.
Well, you
Uh,
said it, I
yeah,
didn't.
yeah. And then maybe on final question here, at least not final. We're still getting questions, but we have 5 minutes left. And a question from Dave Mertz: how can we bring the content of ChatGPT answers automatically in a PowerPoint? So maybe how would you advise building a pipeline from the API to a PowerPoint?
Okay, so I believe Microsoft has this thing called PowerPoint Copilot that automatically does that. So that would be one answer. At least I think we do. But that would be one way to do it. I don't know. This is the creativity aspect. So I think that does it. I'm not 100% sure, but it's possible that within the OpenAI APIs that there's an assistance API that may do that already. I'm not 100% sure, but you could get creative with this stuff. It's definitely a use case, and I actually have those patterns within the repos here. I didn't actually demonstrate that, but you can have OpenAI uh, basically go out and draw you a picture. So it's what's called multimodality. So it's not just text based. So if you describe what you want your picture to look like, it'll draw the picture. So you could tell it, I want a PowerPoint deck that does blah blah blah, and it will do that kind of stuff. I'm not 100% sure it can do PowerPoint, but if you get creative and say, I want a slide that would go into a presentation that looks like this, it will do those types of things.
Yeah, that's great. We have 3 minutes left. In case there's any additional questions to Dave, do reach out via LinkedIn. He owes a couple of you an OpenAI API for the next couple of days to try it out. In case you want to reach out to him, I want to say, Dave, this was a great presentation, great overview of using GPT on Azure. Really, really appreciated the insight. Also, want to say we have more than what it seems, I think more than 400 people tuning in live at the moment. So awesome to see how many people are watching this. Great to see as well so many people all around the world. So for those who are not necessarily in a friendly time zone at the moment, especially thank you for you as well. So thanks for everyone. And do make sure to check out our Azure's fundamental skill track, and we have a QR code on the left hand side for signing up for Radar, our conference next week. So make sure to check that out. Really, really thank you so much. We're getting quite a lot of love here in the crowd. So great session, Dave, from Irina, Sandeep as well. Great session. Thank you all so much again, and have a great rest of the week.